Welcome to Not Two Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. The Marxist Theory of Art by A.V. Lunacharsky. Art and class. Can there be a special aesthetic of the class? Of course there can. Is there any educated person in the world who would deny that different peoples have different aesthetics? You have to be on a very high and specific level of cultural development to be able to find beauty in almost all works of art and be equally delighted with the wooden idol of some Botucudo, the Venus of Milos, and the statue of Bourdelle. It's hard to say which viewpoint is superior. Whether from the point of view of art history, which is able to see in all the aesthetics of different peoples and epochs only variations of a single aesthetic, varieties irreconcilable, themselves contradicting each other, or from the point of view of a person devoted to his style, having determined his taste and therefore intolerant of all that is alien. But be that as it may, it is clear that not only do different peoples have different understandings of the beauty of woman, the beauty of colors, shapes, different embodiments of their deity, their ideals, but that at different times they change these tastes and go to the exact opposite. And if we take a closer look at why tastes change, we see that it is based on changes in the economic structure, on changes in the degree of influence of this or that social class on culture in general. In some cases, this is very striking. So, for example, Goethe says with great wit that a folk fair of a crowd dressed in the most varied motley costumes, with the buzz, the talk, the bursts of laughter, the squeak of pipes, the roar of cattle, the shouts of traders, etc., produces a most intoxicatingly cheerful impression on the common people. On the contrary, the intellectual, according to Goethe, will find these colors screaming, this movement dizzying and tiring, this noise intolerable and heavy, and, except for a headache, will take nothing from the spectacle. On the contrary, some stiff holiday of the intellectuals with their dark suits, with their measured movements, will seem an unbearable bore to a jolly country girl. Chernyshevsky adds with no less wit, the ideal of feminine beauty is characteristic of the peasant on the one hand, and of the intelligentsia on the other. Noble intellectuals, says Chernyshevsky, terribly love a small foot and a small hand. Meanwhile, what do these traits mean? The degeneration, the parasitism, is the same phenomenon that turns some lice into sacks devoid of any organs. The beginning of atrophy of the body is what the aristocratic hand and foot are all about. They would have to inspire unconcealed disgust in people. On the contrary, the peasant can determine with extreme accuracy, when he chooses a bride, the degree of health of the girl, and asks himself whether she will be a good worker, wife, and mother. Her plump fullness, her physical strength, the pronounced signs of femininity in the most immediate sense of the word, that is what will seduce him. So we see examples of the opposition of different poles of society in sharply opposed views in the field of aesthetics. Let us now turn our attention to some particularly striking historical fact. Do we not see how the fluttering cupids on the gilded figurative furniture, on the tapestries of the disfigured ceilings of the Rococo period, turn out to be suddenly scared off by the virtuous burghers of Grèce, and the even drier, more stylish in their design, restrained in their coloring by the patriots of Greece and Rome, whom David, the revolutionary painter, was fond of? Each class carries with it its own aesthetics if it has its own way of life, its own approach to reality, its own ideal. Of course, it is wrong to oppose the proletariat indiscriminately to the bourgeoisie. Bourgeois aesthetics is the aesthetics of upstarts, merchants, and factory owners. Next to it, there is, of course, the mature and definite taste of the aristocracy of the old type, the more or less refined, often developed and lax, but sometimes very noble and high, the taste of the specialist intellectuals, the scanty vulgarity of the petty bourgeois taste, etc., etc. As for the proletariat, it has, of course, revealed comparatively little of its aesthetic face in its works of art or in its living environment. For this, it has been kept too long, so to speak, in the basement of culture, where the rays of the sun of creativity do not penetrate, and from which, as a consequence, no artistic influence rises either. But what could have been expected a priori, which was reflected in certain individual works that bore an undoubtedly proletarian character, written either by intellectuals who were under the strongest influence of the proletariat or by worker artists, is confirmed by the denser sprouts of proletarian art and proletarian aesthetic that we see in the spring meadows of Soviet Russian culture, still blooming under heavy thunder. But the proletariat, it turns out, has, in some respects, revealed its aesthetic face through the creations of certain former classes and groups. Thus, for example, bourgeois engineering imperialism, which gave famous poems in honor of the machine and big industry, like Kellerman, leads us to proletarian poetry in honor of the machine and production. Only capitalists take the machine as a machine, and do not know how to consider it as a helper of humanity, as a great instrument of construction in the realm of justice. In other respects, some Kellermans and some Gustevs are closer to each other than they are to the representative in the poetics of Tolstoy's interpretation of the word, that is, to the taste for the refined and the old, or to the bourgeois with his petty sentimentalism, who sees in the machine only horror, rattle, and soot. On the other hand, the proletariat, to a certain extent, finds kinship with the anarcho-romantic intelligentsia in revolutionary epochs, and sometimes in reactionary epochs as well. In the first case, in groups, in the second case, in units, the intelligentsia artists sharply protested against reality, scathingly scourged the ruling class, and often eloquently and fervently called for revolt. But in these intellectuals' works, one could always sense a certain hysteria, a certain degree of hysteria and idealism detached from life. And here the proletariat, beginning to sing its war songs, brings something more vital and confident into them, and in the horizons of the future, when the proletarian poet reveals them, he brings more breadth, tranquility, and genuine happiness. There are bridges, also, between those realist intellectuals who, with ruthless severity, and sometimes with tears of compassion, painted the life of the poor, with the proletarian desire to tell the whole truth about themselves and their rotten life under the shadow of the capitalist factories. But while the intellectuals sometimes fall into the objectivity of the naturalist, following in the footsteps of Zola, and then snivel over the grief he portrays, the proletariat also brings here a remarkable objectivism and calmness, and at the same time a kind of cold anger, which immediately characterizes the artist not only as observer, but also as fighter. Perhaps most original for the proletarian is the collectivist note in his works. It is not without reason that I named the best among intellectuals, the type of intellectual creator, the anarcho-romantic. The intellectual always has a tendency to individualism. The worker feels more for the masses for all the obvious reasons. Worker poets will be the poets of the masses. They are already beginning to sing their hymn to the masses, for the masses and through the masses. The proletariat will be able to express the originality of this trait when it will be able to build its own palaces and entire cities, to fresco the immeasurable walls, to inhabit them with a people of statues, to make these palaces resound with new music, to stage giant spectacles in the squares of its cities in which spectator and protagonist will mingle in a single celebration. Then the collective creativity to which the proletariat has been raised by the inferno of capitalism will emerge with all its force, and all the basic traits of proletarian art, love of science and technology, a broad view of the future, a militant zeal, a ruthless truthfulness, will then acquire, drawing on the canvas of the collectivist perception of the world and collective creativity, an unheard of scope and barely perceptible depth. Such, in general terms, are the aesthetics of the proletariat. Aesthetics and its forms. 1. Immediate affectivity, that is, suffering or pleasure, pleasure or displeasure, is the necessary basis of the aesthetic emotion. We call all objects that arouse in us an aesthetic emotion beautiful or not beautiful. Can we say that everything that gives us pleasure is beautiful? We have no basis for singling out the pleasant, the grossly pleasurable, from the realm of aesthetics. Everything that tastes good, smells good, everything that is smooth, velvety, everything that is warm when I am cold, and cool when I am hot, I have every right to call aesthetic. But in human speech, the epithet beautiful or not beautiful applies exclusively to the field of visual and auditory sensations, and to the feelings and thoughts mediated by them. To find beauty in old wine or in a glass of cold water on a summer day seems somewhat ridiculous, but meanwhile, we have here an undoubted aesthetic emotion, only in a very primitive form. We have already said that there are two kinds of vitality. The first, vitality of consumption, allows positive affective only as elimination of obvious suffering or displeasure. The second, vitality of overconsumption, on the contrary, provides positive affective also without preliminary suffering, without pronounced, more and more painful need. A being without any vital excess cannot enjoy itself freely. It only restores the equilibrium disturbed by the environment. It feeds and protects itself. Of course, the act of satisfying hunger, of successfully avoiding danger, etc., is accompanied by positive affect, but there is no room for great variety, development, growth, or affect. The limit is set by need. Satisfaction of urgent needs is a pale source of joy, and it is understandable why a person who has learned in a luxurious measure the positive affect much stronger does not include in the concept of beauty those pleasures which are inseparably connected with need, with self-defense. Another thing is a being who is abundantly nourished, who has more strength than he needs under ordinary circumstances, moreover, strength distributed in different organs. Such a being, in order to preserve and grow all organs, must create functions for himself, must play, but this play reflects, of course, the very essence of the organism as adapted to the struggle for existence. The play will consist in reactions occurring in ordinary life, but produced in strict conformity with the law of economy of forces. The pleasure that accompanies the elimination of the vital functions of overconsumption becomes the goal. The greater is the pleasure, the more impure, the more correct and economical is the expenditure of energy. That is, the more results of activity of a given organ are obtained for each unit of energy expended. The muscles want to move as much as possible, more luxuriously, the eyes to see as much as possible, the ears to hear as much as possible, etc. In a free dance, a man discharges the excess of energy with the greatest luxury, because in this kind of dance, the members move freely, that is, according to their own laws. In the perception of an object by the eye and the ear, one has to reckon with the properties of the object, with how easily it is perceived. What is easily perceived? What, so to speak, freely enters the perceiving organ? What does not make it work wrong, is in general pleasant? But for the eye that enjoys the spectacle, it is not the lightness that is important, but the richness of perception, and this richness will be the greater, the easier each element of the spectacle is perceived. The principle of the least expenditure of energy operates here not in the sense of stinginess, but in the sense of prudence. It is necessary to expend the whole given amount of energy, but also to buy with it as much as possible. A luxurious and correct functioning of the eye is required. The same applies to the other organs. In view of the fact that the expenditure of the accumulated nourishment, that is, the transformation into active energy, allows for infinite variety and growth, this kind of enjoyment has become predominantly aesthetic enjoyment. The freedom inherent in it, the subsequent growth of strength and increase in life, all this has placed from high above the simple satisfaction of necessary needs. The vitality of consumption is the vitality of need. The vitality of overconsumption is the thirst for life and creativity. The former ceases with the restoration of energy expended, commensurate with the damage caused by the environment. The latter is infinite, because the luxurious expenditure of energy causes a new, ever-increasing influx of nourishment. Needless to say, these pleasures will take place only when the organism is provided with every inflow of nourishment. A sick organism, the very organs of which are capable of using only a limited amount of food, is incapable of joy of life, of lust for life. In it, the economic principle takes on another meaning. It needs, if possible, to reduce the work of the organs. The rude barbarian is glad of noisy music, shouting colors, wild movements. He does not yet understand by how many times the total amount of pleasure can be increased by regulating the activity of the organs. The true, cheerful aesthete understands this. He pays tribute to the sense of proportion. He knows what an immense variety of sensations can be perceived when a certain order is put into them. Finally, the refined and tired decadent cringes at any loud sound or lively coloring. He needs gray tones, silence, and nuance, because his organs are poor in strength. Here we encounter the law of the relativity of aesthetic appreciation, which we will discuss in more detail in our own place. Now let us move on to examining what it is that man calls beauty. The entire course of phenomena that we perceive is broken down by analysis into elements which cannot be reduced to one another. These are the sensations of time, space, taste, smell, sound, color, tactile, thermal, innervation muscular sensations. As for the sensations of taste, smell, touch, and temperature, they are usually completely excluded from aesthetics and are not recognized as elements of beauty. We have already pointed out that we do not see a particularly profound basis for this. The boundaries which we can draw between these sensations and others, the so-called higher sensations, are as follows. The sensations of taste are closely connected with the sensations of hunger and satiation. The thermal sensations are also directly connected with the needs of the body. These are non-free sensations. However, gustatory pleasures are not reducible to the sensation of satiation. In union with and merging with the sense of smell, taste creates a whole, rather refined range of pleasures, to which some indulge as an art. Olfactory sensations are still more free from the coloring of need and powerfully affect the psyche. Thermal and purely tactile sensations are extremely poor, but the blowing of wind into a heated face, the touch of a polished or gently fluffy surface, are pleasures quite free from the resolution of previous, clearly expressed suffering or longing. Only the relative simplicity of these sensations, their little connection with the general life of the psyche, with the conception of the world, can serve as some basis for singling them out from the field of aesthetics, along with the unpleasant fact that the psychological side of taste and smell has as yet been little examined. But although no one will say that it is possible to create something beautiful from these elements alone, they will undoubtedly indirectly influence the beauty of our complex perceptions. An orange wooden ball has much less aesthetic merit than a ripe orange with its aroma and juiciness. At one glance at an orange, we feel it. There are plenty of examples. The stench can just as much disrupt any aesthetic mood as fragrance can greatly enhance it. The effect of aromas, in this sense, so to speak, of accompaniments of experience, is no less than that of caressing music. But since the psychological picture corresponding to these sensations is not yet clear to us, we shall pass on to the visual, auditory, and innervating senses. An analysis of these gives us the sure key to an understanding of all aesthetic pleasures in the broadest sense of the word. The muscular or innervation sense accompanies all visual perception. Thanks to it, purely visual sensations, sensations of light, receive form and are placed in space. It would be superfluous to speak here about the well-known mechanism of the eye, which contributes to the recognition of the spatial distance of some visual elements from others in all directions of three-dimensional space. The muscles that move the eye in different directions, the muscles that contract the lens, as well as the neck muscles that turn the entire head following the movements of the body being observed, can move correctly or incorrectly. First of all, correct movement is smooth and rhythmic. Experience unequivocally indicates that sharp, impetuous, disorderly twitches of any muscle are immediately felt as something unpleasant. Rhythmicity and regularity have become almost synonymous. The muscles taking part in the process of perceiving the visual world must work correctly and measured. What we call a wavy line, a regular geometric figure, a straight line, a free sweep of the line, a beautiful and correct rhythm of an ornament, all these simply meet the requirements of the organization of the eye. In contrast, a broken line, an irregular circle, sharp and angular body shapes, etc., make the eye repeatedly change its direction and expend a lot of effort. Thus, ease of perception underlies the eye's assessment of the correctness, pleasingness of figures, etc. Experience teaches with certainty that it is the correct figures that are pleasing to the eye, and the incorrect ones that are unpleasant. The same considerations can be applied to the movements of bodies in space observed by the eye. Every rhythm presupposes that the following element is like the preceding one. Consequently, the perceptive organ, having adapted itself to the perception of one element, readily perceives the others. Everything rhythmic is easily perceived. Rhythmic movements are easily reproduced, so rhythm is the basis of formal aesthetics. This is even clearer in the world of sounds than in the visual world. Not only are rhythmic beats perceived as relatively pleasant, and each irregularity of rhythm is immediately reflected in the mind as an unpleasant jolt, but physicists have managed to decompose the very elements, tones, and it turns out that those tones, as well as timbres and chords that consist of rhythmic air vibrations, are pleasant. Graphically drawing themselves, these pleasant sounds draw an undulating line with more or less complex but correctly alternating waves. Thus, the auditory apparatus is apparently subject to the same law as the neuromuscular apparatus of the eye. It is much more difficult to speak about visual sensations proper, i.e., light. There are hypotheses that reduce them, as well as all other sensations, to mechanical laws, but these are only hypotheses based on the idea of chemistry as mechanics of infinitesimal bodies. The only thing that is clear to us is this. Very insignificant light is unpleasant, like very insignificant sound, and makes the eye strain and waste a mass of energy unproductively. Excessively bright light, like a deafening sound, immediately dissipates a huge mass of visual energy, in all likelihood chemical energy, and feels like pain. This is strictly consistent with our premise. The most beautiful are the so-called saturated colors, i.e., those that consist of some elements without an admixture of others. Since colors physically represent only a gradual gradation of shorter and shorter electromagnetic waves, objectively having no sharp edges inside them, we must assume that the eye has several groups of organs, each of which is adapted to react only to waves of a certain length. With this perfectly legitimate assumption, it becomes clear why the waves that strictly correspond to the structure of one or another group of perceivers turns out to be light, i.e., pleasant for them, and why, in this case, the most pleasant is the thickest, most intense color. Mixed colors cause wrong reaction of different elements of an eye and cause fatigue, or, on the contrary, in some cases, are qualified as dull, and dull, absolutely, for the same reasons on which a rhythmically wavy line is more beautiful than a simple, straight line. That is, because for aesthetic satisfaction and ease of perception, there should also be a great sum of correct work. That is the greater richness of sensations. We cannot enter here into consideration of the difficult relations which exist between different colors. Pleasant or unpleasant sequences or combinations of colors, obviously, are explained by the fact that the very processes excited by them in an eye are partly similar, partly mutually opposite. In any case, the same law must apply here. The fact that colors are divided into so-called warm and cold colors is very important. Bright red color has the highest warmth. Blue color is the coldest. Warm colors lead the psyche to an excited state, and cold ones have a calming effect. Recognition of more pleasant one or other colors in the highest degree depends on temperament and general state of mind of the subject. Sick, weak, irritated, sad organisms seek darkness. Abundant dispersion of energy in the eye fast rhythmic work in the visual nerves and corresponding centers of the brain cause a general increase in the tone of life. Like loud music, bright visual impressions increase metabolism. The whole organism, so to speak, adjusts to a more energetic way. Of course, the body, which is under the general pressure of vital overexpenditure, reacts extremely negatively to such a phenomenon, caused by the same reasons as the positive. But gloom and silence, though praised by poets of weary people, still do not quite meet their needs, at least less than the grayish or bluish twilight, cold, barely nuanced colors, and quiet, caressing sounds. And this is because darkness and silence leave the sick organism alone with itself, do not help it. All well and good if it is possible to fall asleep, but if the vitality of overconsumption still gives itself over as suffering? Quiet sounds and vague images are soothing, distracting. They bring the trembling, improperly vibrating nervous system into a slow, rhythmic oscillation. Here is the root of two kinds of art: the invigorating, upbeat one, and the soothing, healing one. In music, cold and warm colors correspond to major and minor combinations of tones. It is difficult to specify a purely physiological basis for minor and major, but any person who cries or groans does so in minor, while laughing and cheering in major, as if minor is equivalent to the word sad, major to the word vivacious, and this mood, irrespective of the tempo, is probably explained by the fact that the relaxed organism, taking a certain tone, cannot endure it and detonates down to the behemoth, i.e., lowers the tone, while the jubilant one, thanks to the ever-new surge of energy, lifts it up. I think that the association with these ways of expressing grief and joy in higher organisms is what makes minor music so pleasing to the relaxed organism. Thus, the aesthetic appreciation of visual and auditory perceptions is dependent on the amount of energy that the organism has at its disposal and on the greater or lesser correctness of its expenditure. That is, on whether in perception the eye and ear can react in full accordance with the whole structure. Man is the measure of all things. Now we can point out that in the realm of the lower senses, the same laws seem to prevail. Smell and taste, too, require more or less energy. The word fresh, to such an extent, describes an insufficiently complete discharge of vital importance of overconsumption, in that it is applied to many related phenomena from the most diverse spheres. They say a fresh article, fresh music. The opposite is the sharp and salty taste. It is more interesting and meaningful, and causes a greater dissipation of energy, hence, of course, the expressions like attic salt, etc. But sharp and salty tastes can be excessive. Judging by the way the face wrinkles, it is clear that the taste centers work extremely strongly, which produces irritation of other nearby centers. Likewise, the most pleasant odor is felt as unpleasant when it is excessively intensified. Of course, it is still difficult to say why one or another odor is pleasant or unpleasant. Regarding tastes, we can say almost definitely that all tastes, sour, salty, sharp, bitter, etc., are moderately pleasant, but we cannot say the same about smells. In any case, in a short article, there is no space for a detailed consideration of these, comparatively very unimportant for aesthetic sensations. Thus, in general, we can establish the rule that all elements, the perception of which is accompanied by a positive affect, are elements easily perceived, as if adapted to the human organs, which quite coincide with the biomechanical laws as well. These elements can greatly benefit from the combination in which they are. Let us leave the lower senses completely aside and deal only with the visual and auditory elements. They all benefit from rhythmic repetition. There is no need to spread about the meaning of this fact. Symmetry is a particular case of rhythm. It is seen from a simple experience. If we make an ink blot on a piece of paper of a regular shape and then fold it twice, the blot will be imprinted on both its halves and a symmetrical figure will appear, undoubtedly possessing a minimal but evident aesthetic value. As soon as known unity, known correctness is introduced into the perception, it is now greatly facilitated and appreciated all the higher. There is no doubt, however, that ease of perception is not always identical with aesthetic merit. Generally speaking, the ear and the eye constantly follow the mass of noises and forms, which are highly confused and irregular. Both organs, during the whole period of awakening, are occupied with the intensive work of analyzing the chaos of noises and visual spots, their placement in space. The corresponding centers are busy recognizing them, i.e., bringing them under generalizations acquired by previous experience. Therefore, everything correct and easy is at once singled out in our consciousness as pleasant. However, if we concentrate our attention on some limited circle of visual or auditory sensations, when we want to enjoy a sight or music, we demand not only that the elements be light, but also a general increase in richness of impressions. We want to expend approximately the same amount of perceptive energy as in ordinary life, but instead of the jolts, bumps, and convulsions of disorganized reality, we desire the opportunity for a systematic work of the organs. If we are invited to listen to a monotonous sound rhythm, diverting our attention from other sounds, we will very soon find it boring. Each new element of it will be perceived more and more easily, but the organ will receive work so insufficient that if the preceding overuse of energy is not expressed in a demand for rest, such music will be found repugnant. We shall return elsewhere to this fact and show all its tremendous significance. To avoid this impression of boredom, every continuing phenomenon must be varied, but this variety must be natural. Unfortunately, we cannot enter here into a detailed consideration of the laws of aesthetic variety as well as aesthetic contrast. The general rule in this is one. The work of the perceptive organs in the center must be brought to a maximum with the preservation of its complete correctness. If this or that visual or auditory phenomenon captures all the energy that the organ can expend, and at the same time shakes it rhythmically, correctly, then the highest pleasure is obtained, instantly capturing the whole human nervous system in one sensation of rapture, bordering on a sweet self-flagellation. But the elements and combinations which we have examined do not exhaust the whole field of beauty. They constitute only the field of formal beauty. Every perception in the human psyche evokes certain associations, an entourage of accompanying representations, powerfully contributing to the aesthetic significance of this or that phenomenon. In some cases, these associative elements are infinitely more significant than the formal ones themselves. Thus, for example, a human being, even the most beautiful one, evaluated as a visual pattern, is a poorly and unimportantly painted figure, as he would appear in a picture or even a first-rate artist, for a being who has never seen a man. But this figure, for us, is associated with a mass of representations, and the power of aesthetic emotion may be enormous. There are thousands of examples of this kind. Two kinds of associations have the greatest aesthetic significance: associations with the representation of pleasure and sympathetic associations. There is no doubt that the ripe fruit makes an aesthetic impression on us, partly because it tastes good, that associations of taste and smell also contribute to the beauty of so-called nature morte, still lifes, that female beauty is evaluated in terms of sexual pleasures, etc. If we see a person in front of us and find him beautiful, our judgment is very little determined by formal elements, although, of course, the symmetry of the face, curly hair, etc. have their importance. Much more important are associations of pleasure. They make a woman's beauty especially sensitive for a man and vice versa. There is no doubt, however, that an aesthetically developed man as well as a woman may find pleasure in the contemplation of persons of the same sex. Here, the most important associative elements, the sympathetic elements, come into play. Many sensations experienced by others immediately infect us, give us, as it were, an echo of the same feeling, set us in the same mood. Sickness, wounds, all kinds of suffering, weakness, stupidity, in a word, everything that is itself either an already manifested overuse of life or a clear sign of the organism's helplessness in front of such life. Any lowered life is perceived as something aesthetically negative. Conversely, increased life, health, strength, intelligence, joy, etc., are elements of the highest beauty. Human beauty, both of the body and the face, is reduced, predominantly, to a set of traits that denote a healthy, strong organism, gifted with a lively and rich psyche. Slimness, strength, freshness, vivacity, a large facial angle, in general, the sign of a well-developed brain, expressive eyes, these are the main elements of beauty. Here we can still add the sensual elements, i.e., secondary sexual traits. The beauty of animals, which in general are subjected to the same requirements, and the principle of slenderness of the body changes each time according to the general type of the structure of the animal, can be static or dynamic. The first beauty is beauty that we can see even if the animal is not moving, while the dynamic beauty is the beauty of movements. This includes, first of all, grace of movements. Gracious we call the freest movements, made without any visible tension of strength. Every effort that we state, in general, is unpleasant, but easy movements immediately infect us with a kind of anticipation of freedom and are accompanied by a very significant positive affectation. But the gift of reproducing as a reflection the moods and feelings of living beings is not limited to this. The human face is the object of the external world, with the movement of which an infinite variety of associations is connected. It would be very difficult for us to determine immediately which movements correspond exactly to offense, joy, contempt, pain, and thousands of other soul movements. We cannot say that a gentle smile is more beautiful than a contemptuous grimace in a formal sense, but we do, so to speak, read the entire music of a man's soul on his face. There is no doubt that sympathy originally served cognition. The animal must have vividly discerned how to feel another living being, friend or foe, what to expect from him, how to relate to him. And now, of course, people with the most developed sensitivity can know the human soul better than others, if only they have enough power of abstraction to generalize and systematize their experiences in this field. At the same time, it should be noted that the positive affect that arises in us as a result of the soul movement of another person, reflected on his face, can have a twofold meaning. Reading on the face a tender smile, we can associate with it the idea that this person is favorable to us, which promises us benefits and joys. Or we can simply feel the quiet peace of kindness in the soul of this person, and, reflecting it in our soul, enjoy its glow ourselves. Man not only reads in this way the face and movements of other people and many animals, he also seeks by analogy to read the soul, the mood of inanimate objects, the surrounding landscapes, plants, buildings, etc. This ability serves as one of the main sources of poetry. Poetry testifies to this kind of spiritualization of the inanimate so loudly that we need not prove our position. The so-called dynamic symmetry, to which most of the laws of architecture are reduced, is nothing other than the result of such spiritualization. If a disproportionate weight rests on a column, we do not approve of this, not because we fear its collapse, it can also be drawn, but because we get the impression that it is heavy. We attribute lightness, grace, and slenderness to architectural works, just as we speak of sullen clouds, sad sunsets, angry gusts of wind, smiling mornings, etc. all too often. We sense in our psyche an unexpected emotion, as if inspired from without, and by analogy with sympathetic suggestion, we assume a soul alive in the surrounding objects. All beauty is created out of those elements which are formally positive, that is, which are easily perceived, out of those associative elements which are reduced to feelings of joy of life, an increase of energy, and which also increase our vital energy, as if turning us to a new, more correct, more powerful, and economical rhythm. Beautiful is that which is aesthetic in all its elements. The skillful combination of the elements further exalts the beauty of them. But the realm of the beautiful, in a broad sense, is not exhausted by the notion of the beautiful. Broken lines, dull colors, dissonances and cries, suffering of body and soul, can be elements of the beautiful in general, though in no way beautiful. How then can anti-aesthetic phenomena receive aesthetic coloring? This question will occupy us in the next chapter.